Okay, we have a few more people coming in from the waiting room. But for everybody who's coming out of the waiting room now, we would love for you to turn on your camera. We can see everyone's beautiful faces as we kick off this Zoom event. Thank you to everybody for turning on your camera, at least for this portion, so we can see all of you. All righty. So this Zoom event is called Non-Academic Careers for International PhDs and Postdocs in the US. We're going to have a panel discussion as well as a networking session in breakout rooms. So thank you so much to all of our PhDs and postdocs and senior research scientists and other staff scientists across all of the New York City area institutions, as well as some other institutions affiliated with Grow Biotech. We had, a really high level of interest in this event, so we're so glad that all of you are here with us this afternoon in order to learn more about different opportunities to explore in industry after finishing your training. I'm just going to briefly introduce all of the panelists now, but you had seen in the email I sent out to kind of outline the structure of the event. I did include all of the panelists' LinkedIn profiles there. So if you want, after today, if you do want to look them up on LinkedIn and see if you have additional questions, you can find all of our 7 panelists on LinkedIn as well. And they represent a variety of different career options within industry, and as more specifically, how they're going to share their story about how, as an international scholar, they were able to successfully pursue these options after finishing their training at a New York City area institution. So we have, I'll just go in alphabetical order by last name, but first we have Sami Belhaj, who's a scientist at Ambry Genetics. Sami, thanks so much for being here this afternoon. We appreciate it. Okay, our second
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, yeah, it was an honor. Our second panelist is Brendan Delaney, who's an immigration attorney with Frank and Delaney Immigration Law. And Brendan was also part of this event last year as well with INET. So Brendan, thank you again for participating. We really appreciate it. Our third panel.
Yep, thanks for having me back.
Of course, yeah. Our third panelist is Linda Mala. She's an associate manager in research program management at Regeneron. Linda, thanks for being here today as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Great. Okay, our fourth panelist is Daria Shlueva, who's worked at Clade Therapeutics and Generation Bio as a senior scientist previously. Daria, thank you so much for being here today as well. Great. And we have Zhonming Wang, who's a scientist 3 in immunology discovery at Genentech. Zhonming, nice to see you over Zoom. Thanks for being here again.
My pleasure.
And Wanjun Wu, who's a scientist at Amgen. Wanjun, thanks for being here today as well.
Hi, everyone.
Coming to us from the West Coast and then back to the East Coast, last but not least, we have Jean Zhang, who's a principal scientist at Regeneron as well. Jean, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So we have 7 panelists. We have Brendan Delaney as our kind of immigration lawyer representation there, and then 6 other panelists. Myself, I'm Thaliana Stathis. For those of you who haven't met me before, I had sent all the emails leading up to this event. I work in the Office of Career and Professional Development at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And my colleague here as the president of INET NYC, representing INET, is Aysegul. Aysegul, do you want to briefly introduce yourself? And also, Aysegul would also just like to very briefly present on behalf of INET, and then we're going to continue our presentations from there.
Thanks, Eliana. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. And I would like to again thanks for all our panelists. And before kicking off this event, I'm just going to briefly talk about the INET. And let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I promise it's not going to take too much time. So INET stands for International Networking for NYC, and we are a group of scientists all around the 3-state area. And our aim is support and offer professional development. And most of our scientists are probably most of them postdocs, but we have grad students, and we are trying to help community building and trying to facilitate networking and through these kind of events as we are having tonight. And we are creating and hosting so many other events as well. And we are doing info sessions and research opportunities inside and outside US. And for now, let me switch. Currently, we have like over 900 scientists all around, again, 3-state area. And we have a good representation of the all around the city, like NYU, Cold Harbor Spring, and Rutgers, so on and so forth. And we are open to new volunteers. So if you are interested in joining us, please send us an email. We are pretty active on all our social channels, and probably one of our board members typing our channels right now on the chat. So please join us and follow us. Lastly, briefly, we have an upcoming fun event. We are not only creating this kind of career event or professional event, we are having fun as a postdoc and grad student. So please take it in consideration joining our event. And lastly, I would like to thank all of our co-founders and past and previous board members keeping INET get going. And with that, I will hand over the floor to Brendan. And before handing over, I would like to again thank Brendan because he's our sponsor and generously helping us to keep going as well. Thanks, Brendan, and take it over, please.
Thank you, and thanks for having me back here today. So I am going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen and then start this session. So I hope everybody can see that okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start, my first few slides are going to be a little bit of an introduction, informational, and then when I get to some of the slides on specific visas, I'm going to pause. Some of my fellow panelists are going to weigh in with some personal and professional experiences. So I hope that everyone in the audience today gets a lot of good informational background in terms of how people have navigated this. I will start by saying that yes, I am an attorney, but no, this is not legal advice. So there's our legal disclaimer for everybody today. This is for educational and informational purposes only. So we'll get that out of the way and we'll go ahead and get started. One thing I like to say when I do these sessions, and I would, I'd be interested to hear sort of personally and professionally from some of my panelists is, as you navigate this journey, and for many people, they'll navigate it in different ways, to be ready to be flexible in terms of the different visas and opportunities that are in front of you. And that ultimately recognizing the idea of sort of short, medium, and long-term goals. So yes, I am an immigration attorney. I also work a lot with the National Postdoctoral Association, if anyone's aware of that, more academic-oriented organization. I am on their advisory council. So, for international postdocs in the United States, more than 50% of postdocs in the US are foreign nationals. You are further down your career path as an early to mid-career researcher. And so how to navigate the industry transition, because that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So these are different issues that people face. There's different issues making the transition to industry versus staying in academia. So which visas are there to use? Which is the best sort of possibilities to harness? Well, the most commonly utilized visas, and without even getting into the O1 and beyond, is the F1 OPT, the STEM extension, the J1 Research Scholar, and the H1B. So there's a lot of temporary visa out there. However, this is not a one-size-fits-all journey, and people will navigate it in different ways. You'll hear that actually in a moment when some of my colleagues chime in. So just as an introduction, if you're in academia, remember, even if you're looking to transition to industry, you're still under the umbrella of your international office if you're on an F or a J or something like that. And, you'll talk to friends, you'll talk to colleagues, but remember, different institutions, titles and positions matter because they can be a little different at institution A versus university B, etc. Talk to your career office, learn about your different alternatives, what's best for you, both personally and professionally moving forward. Engage with the network organizations. They're being proactive. The resources are there for you. Use your diaspora. They may be able to open doors for you. I think you're going to hear from, again, some of my panelists, my colleagues today, the ability to network, the opportunity to network, the importance of that. So these are all sort of starters. So be proactive as you sort of navigate the visa and immigration journey. Attend the seminars and programs, but don't just attend the ones on the visa and immigration. What about the science writing, the CV, maybe the networking on LinkedIn? There's a bunch of resources out there. and reaching out to mentors and colleagues can also provide you with a good and solid platform from which to proceed. So get the knowledge and stay informed. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't talk about what was sort of happening out there in US immigration. And here's some sort of broad issues that I think people are facing that are encountering in a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Yes, there are delays and inconsistent timelines, and that is impacting people's decision-making process and how they're navigating this. However, and we're going to touch on this in a little bit, you're going to hear some feedback. What about the national interest waiver applications? A lot of them are actually being adjudicated fairly quickly. Most people, when they're now processing their adjustment of status, they're being processed without an interview. So you're seeing central offices just issuing green cards. However, there are some collateral issues. There's a lack of combination cards being issued. So for example, if you navigate your green card directly, maybe from a J, you may get a work card, but not a travel permit. You can work, but not travel. That's an issue. These are real issues that people are facing. December 2023, there was an advisory published by Immigration indicating that if you had an F1 visa, that travel after filing a perm or I-140 would seem to be permitted. That was always a bit of a gray area previously, so that is a positive move forward. No question, we are seeing more significant visa retrogression this year. We'll touch on that a little bit later. That is impacting people's decision-making, and it's definitely impacting how you're going to navigate all this. So there's uncertainty about timelines moving forward, and unfortunately, just as of the other day, filing fees have now increased for the majority of immigration-related applications. With that being said, broadly speaking, and as a good segue into what we're sort of going to talk about over the next few minutes and beyond, is what about the deference to STEM? So for a number of years, it had sort of been touched on, talked about, you know, people went around it. There was the idea that STEM was there. And finally, this administration has done something about it. Immigration tends to be almost governed by executive order these days. We're seeing little to no progress in Congress. So we've seen the Biden administration actually move positively in STEM-related applicants. We've seen the January 2022 and the June 2023 guidance. So what is it? How is it being applied? And why is it important? So in 2022, there was guidance published related to the evaluation of evidence for national interest waiver applications and O1 visas. They indicated that a PhD in STEM would be seen as persuasive for NIW applications, and additional weight being granted to expert letters from governmental entities and agencies. In 2023, this was expanded to include EB1A and EB1B, with new examples being provided of supporting evidence for STEM applicants. And these are all advances in the adjudication process or the advisories to immigration officers that can help you make the transition to industry. I want to be clear. The standard of adjudication that you'll hear from and some of my colleagues today who have gone through this personally, the standard hasn't changed per se, but now what it does is it enables US immigration officers to harness different evidence and to weigh evidence in a slightly more positive manner for STEM applicants. But you do have to be prepared and think ahead. I recently had the opportunity to do an immigration and career development session with two colleagues, and these were just some of the sort of slides that they had shared. So I just wanted to bring it in here because these are some of the ideas and goals to think about when you're sort of making career transition and career development. So you have this idea, recipe for success, but for a foreign national, you have this added hurdle. And that's your visa status, and that are the different visa options that are potentially, or that are going to be in front of you, not potentially. So what is your immigration plan, and how does that sort of align with your career progression and your professional development? So this is where I'm going to start to pause a little bit. I'm going to, open some things up, and we're going to go through some different areas. But these are, I think, some of the issues and questions that people and my colleagues today probably faced. Some of them navigated it. Some of these, maybe they didn't. But, I'd like to hear maybe as an input to pass it over about some of these issues and questions. If anybody wants to chime in. What about so who had to make, as a panelist, who had to make a decision, J1, H1B, or OPT? Were these different visas that were sort of front and center for your decision making?
So I can just kick that. I didn't have to choose the kind of visas, in my case, my employer reached out to attorneys, which kind of took the case and kind of settled on that the O1A would be the right choice for me specifically. So I didn't have to do the choosing myself. I don't know about the rest of my colleagues on the call.
I didn't have to choose, but I had to navigate the complexity with the pending national interest waiver concurrent application. And then you always have to think which status you can go or return, because once you have pending adjustment of status, it kind of limits your options. For example, J1, extending J1, O1, extending O1, and so on.
So good. And, broadly speaking, as people navigate their career, these are different, generally speaking, different sort of visa options that are on the table. But as a foreign national residing in the United States, as you sort of start your career, expand your career, that question at the bottom is the one that ultimately we all have to face. I faced it I'm from Ireland. I'm not a scientist, but I still had to face this. Do I want to be here temporarily or permanently? And so these are all sort of factors to take into consideration. So I think we had one or two people had sort of utilized this as their next step. So I'm just going to talk about this briefly, and then I can hand it over. But I mean, I could do a whole session on F1 OPT and STEM extension. Regardless, if you're on your OPT, you're on your F1 or your OPT or your STEM extension, remember, in an academic setting, again, you're still under the umbrella of the international office. The post-completion OPT is good for 12 months, and the STEM extension is good for an additional 24. You must have a qualifying STEM degree, and generally speaking, under the STEM extension, there must be a bona fide employer-employee relationship. Generally speaking, under the STEM extension, the idea of volunteering self-employment not permitted. If you utilize the OPT post-completion and or the STEM extension to make that step towards industry and you're leaving academia, just remember, think about those next steps, think about your visa options beyond that, i.e. the H1B cap, because if you don't win the lottery, then options may start to dwindle. So it's just something to be aware of. One of my colleagues earlier mentioned the O1, which we'll get to in a moment. But I understand from our discussion earlier, there was one or two people who were going to talk a little bit about OPT experience. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And I was wondering, Jean-Ming, if you wouldn't mind kicking off the conversation and kind of tell us what position you were in when you were looking for, so now you're based at Genentech, when you were looking for a role in industry, and how you explained your situation being on OPT to the employers.
Sure. So I defended in summer of 2022 and transitioned into being a postdoc in the same lab. That's when I started my post-completion OPT. And about 6 months into my OPT, I started looking for jobs, and then eventually landed this opportunity. So during the interview process, there will be a lawyer, like an immigration assessment by the company, and they will determine what is the best path forward. So this part is actually hidden to you, but then there is actually assessment of what the risk of long-term retention of the worker if an offer were to be made to them. In the case of OPT, it's quite easy to transition into a different job. During the post-completion, there was very little barrier as long as you can justify how this, well, it's almost like standard. The STEM extension takes a little bit of qualification, and as Brandon just explained, you have these different boxes to check, but then the usually for bigger companies, the immigration team hired by the company will take care of that. So it wasn't like a very abrupt transition. It didn't delay my entrance into industry by any. And then after that, they'll discuss with me like what are the options for after my STEM extension expires. And the obvious ones are either H1B or O1, but then there's lottery and other consideration that goes into this. So it wasn't like, for me, it wasn't difficult at all because I was still quite early in my OPT when I entered industry. So there's plenty of time left for us to juggle the different options and prepare accordingly.
Great. And Xiaoming, just a quick follow-up, because I know your personal situation, if you wouldn't mind talking about how did you discuss with the employer, since it's temporary, it's, you know, up to basically a total of 3 years. How did they view what your sponsorship would look like after the OPT has ended? Did you have that discussion during the interviews or the negotiation?
So not too much. So my understanding is that there was an assessment sent to the hiring team about the risk associated with my immigration status. They have their own criteria. I don't know anything about rubrics or anything, but I didn't have to discuss this in length with my hiring manager. So the hiring manager ultimately has the call to weigh this risk against what the candidate can potentially bring into this position. So for my manager, she does not read too much into this assessment. It's more in terms of how can this person start, whether they need to be transitioned onto a different status before they start, and how long that's gonna take. So that's something they care more than, okay, like whether this person will be able to stay in the long term. Usually if you have a PhD and you've done some preparatory work, you get enough citations and paper reviews, it's not terribly difficult for the company to figure out some alternative ways for you to continue working past your STEM extension. So for me personally, I didn't have to persuade my hiring manager, but I did hear from other people that other companies might take it more seriously, and there's just not so much you can do in convincing them that there's a viable approach unless they actually see that you figured out like you are able to be transferred until onto the different status until you can, like, before you start your job. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Wanjun is also another panelist who's at Amgen. Wanjun, was your story similar or different to that of Xiaoming? Or how much time had you already been on your OPT when you were interviewing with Amgen?
So my timeline and the process is pretty similar to Xiaoming's. So I graduated in May 2022, and then I started my OPT in June. And so I stayed at the lab that I did my PhD for a couple more months as a postdoc to wrap up my research. And then I kind of started my job searching a little bit earlier, but then I ended up starting my new position in Amgen in January 2023. So that said, by the time I started, I already used 7 months of my OPT. So my experience interviewing with Amgen, so the same at the beginning, the HR give me a evaluation form, a lot of questions that I need to fill in regarding immigration status, my contribution, my citation, and then they will send that to their legal team, so they will evaluate. And then we didn't have much discussion about that until we were discussing about the offer. So the HR just directly told me that for Amgen, if the manager thinks the whatever scientist is contributing well, have good outcome, they can request to start a green card application, and the company will sponsor that. Right. So that still depends on after you join the company, after 6 months, whether your manager is satisfied with your contribution. And then if yes, he or she can start the request, but Amgen will not contact you directly. Right. So you need to discuss and be proactive and talk about that with your manager. And also the HR, so right after I joined the company, because I joined in January, and then so the H-1B lottery usually start the registration in March, and Amgen just directly put all of their international scientists to the lottery. Yeah. So for me, this is my case, right?
Great. Thank you for sharing, Wanjun. And also finally, one of our panelists, Linda, you were on OPT for some time. Could you briefly just share what was going on there?
I can add a little bit. So I was an international student in the US for many years. First, I came as an undergrad. It was about 4 to 5 years, and then PhD. So in total, I was a decade dealing with visas and kind of figuring out my career path on top of all the intricacies of the visa immigration system. So I joke with my friends and say that throughout all these years, I kind of became an immigration lawyer as well for myself. And, you know, obviously the first step I think is to kind of educate yourself. So you are aware of kind of your options and the strategy that you can take and the options that are available to you. Regarding the OPT, so I applied for the OPT 2 times, one time when I finished undergrad and one time when I finished PhD. The thing that I want to tell folks is that this is also a time sensitive application. It needs to be done at like a specific time right before, at least during my time, it was a specific time right before you graduate. So you need to like really like logistically coordinate it very well when you graduate. And I'm aware of cases when things were not done correctly and they kind of lost the opportunity to use the OPT. So obviously be very proactive in these processes, right? Sure, you have the immigration office and the international student office to support you, but they have so many other students, and it's very human that sometimes errors can be made and things fall through the cracks. So you are responsible first and foremost for applying on time, figuring out, what are the steps and what do I need to do, and like thinking about it ahead of time, not when you are graduating and looking for jobs. The application is pretty straightforward, I think, because it's helped through the international student office. So that was the case for me. The other aspect was educating companies as you are interviewing. The previous panelists shared their experiences, and a lot of the initiative was taken by the companies itself, but these are bigger companies with a lot of resources, with years of experience in recruiting international scientists, right? There might not be the case for you. You might be working for, you might be applying for jobs for smaller companies or nonprofits or, smaller startup biotechs. And in a lot of those, they are not as well resourced, right? Or don't have as many years of experience. So I'll try to maybe even educate them during the interview process so they don't close the doors on you, because the OPT is a pretty straightforward path and they don't need to do much. So that was my experience with through the interviews, right? I had a lot of interviews in various industries, and that was my experience that, not always they are well informed. You need to inform them.
Thank you, Linda. I love this theme of self-advocacy and education of yourself and others, and speaking up for yourself, being proactive. That's all part of that, is being here tonight with us as well, learning more. Great, thank you. Yeah, I think those were the 3 panelists to comment on this slide. Brendan, if you'd like to continue or say anything else.
Good. Yeah, no, I think that covered that was a lot of good information. And good to hear some of the differences, are interesting here. I suppose some of the differences between the larger companies, the bigger organizations, the smaller. That's been my experience too. I mean, you do have to advocate for yourself. I'm going to touch on this in a little bit. You also need to do it at the right times as well. J1s, I'm going to move quickly through these. I don't think we have anyone that's going to speak to this. This is, generally speaking, a more academic visa, the J1 research scholars, usually harnessed in an academic setting. I think it's fair to say it's becoming a little bit more common in an industry setting. Some of the bigger companies are now harnessing the J1 research scholar visa in an industry setting, but it's most commonly in academia. The big one to remember about the J1 is that if you're subject to the 2-year home residence requirement, you've got to take care of that you either have to fulfill it or get a waiver. But I'm not going to spend too much time in that because it's a more academic situation. H1Bs. Remind me, do we have 1 or 2 people to talk about this on the H1Bs?
I don't think we do.
Okay, well, I'll just run through this quickly then in terms of the big points. So basically, the big issues on the H1B is cap exempt versus cap subject. And if you are in an academic setting, you're going to be exempt from the cap. A university can file a H1B on your behalf at any time. That is not the case in industry. So this year, the US government fiscal year runs October 1st around to September 30th. So therefore, H1Bs traditionally, the lottery registration period starts, and then you can file them on or after April 1st, 6 months ahead of October. This year's lottery registration period has closed. And again, everything was oversubscribed, so it's just been reached. A couple of differences to the H1B than the F and the J that we just talked about a moment ago is that it is dual intent. So it can be maintained up until the day you get your green card. Somebody mentioned earlier the issues over travel, adjusting status, things like that. So on the H1B, you have a little bit more of a safety blanket there. But know the policies where you are, titles and positions do matter. In an industry context, how can you work on a H1B? Well, if you get selected in the lottery, that's great. If you do not, what do you do? Well, there's limited options. One option is, however, to work for an industry company, but at a cap-exempt organization, at a university. You can work on a concurrent H1B. So, for example, if you hold a cap-exempt H1B at a university, but then you have a part-time concurrent H1B in industry. However, it's important to remember, because I get this question a lot, you cannot just make a straight transfer of a cap-exempt H1B to a cap subject position. Okay, so I can't take a cap-exempt H1B, pour water on it, and make it cap subject. That's not how it works. You would have to enter the lottery. But those are the main some of the main issues for the H1B. I know we do have someone to talk about this. So I'm going to talk about the O1 very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it over to one of my colleagues. High standard. Yeah, we're up in the ante a little bit as you move from the OPT to the H1B to the O1. I suspect a little bit, hearing from some of my colleagues earlier, that some of this due diligence that the companies are looking at, I suspect that is, to what extent are they seeing you as a potential applicant for an O1 down the line? Because that may align with some of what I heard earlier, looking at your credentials earlier. Do you have these citations? Because an O1, if you don't get into the H1B lottery, that's going to be the next logical step. A couple of things to note for the O1, and then I'll hand it over. Obviously, it's a good option for industry because it's always available and there's no discernible time limit. If you're subject to the 2-year home residence requirement, you do not need a waiver to get the O1. That's not the case for a H1B or a green card. It is an employer-sponsored application. There sometimes is a little bit of misinformation out there about that. It is a restrictive standard, but we now have a little bit of additional deference to STEM applicants, and this helps. And this is enabling, I think, more additional applicants to be approved than previously. And I understand that I have 1 or 2 people who are going to talk about their experiences here a little bit, so I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Brendan. Daria, if you wouldn't mind if we could start with you. I know that when you were finishing your scientist role at MSK, your job after that was at Generation Bio, and they had sponsored you for an O1. But I do remember you telling me it took some time to figure all of that out. If you could share more.
Yeah, unfortunately, all my application took forever, so everything went wrong. First of all, I'd like to echo what was said, that you are responsible to logistically coordinate everything, have a strategy. So my strategy was actually to apply for national interest waiver while being a postdoc at MSK. And then at that time, concurrent application was possible. It means that I also applied for adjustment of status, and it allows you to receive the work authorization. You still have to wait for several months, but at that time, we thought it would take maybe 6 months maximum or something like this. So I kind of timed it and I decided probably I'll get it by the end of 2021. And on all my resumes, I wrote that I will be eligible, authorized to work in the States by November 2021. I don't know if it helped or not, but at least I believed in that. And then Generation Bio, they essentially we went through the interview process and everything, but they didn't want to wait for my work authorization. So it was them who suggested to apply for O1. But since I already had my package for national interest waiver ready, that was kind of easy for the legal team and the law firm that they hired to assess everything and apply for O1 visa. And for O1 visa, there is a premium, premium way of doing things. And then in principle, you can get it pretty quickly, but unfortunately, everything took like for me 9 months. So, and I was a bit relaxed because I really believed that I would get my work authorization. And unfortunately, my work authorization took 15 months. So, but in the end, I got it and I started the Generation Bio on O1 visa, and it didn't affect my salary negotiation. It didn't affect my bonus, and I still had a very competitive package.
Great, thank you, Daria. And Sammy, who's at Ambry Genetics, you are also, and you had mentioned earlier that the company decided the O1 would be the best option for you. So how much were you involved in that process? What did you have to prepare, and how long did it take?
Yeah, sure. So so I also transitioned from a J1 to an O1 visa. I think I was fortunate now here in Daria. I think my case was very speedy, to say the least. I think the portion of the O1 that took most time was to prepare, to draft and prepare all the expert, recommendation letters, because the lawyers do ask you to prepare them yourself, to draft them. And if anyone is not familiar with those letters, they're borderline insane, because they put you, pretty much as a Nobel Prize winner, which kind of embarrassing to forward that to kind of leaders in their field and saying, hey, I'm a Nobel Prize candidate, So anyways, that part, was the part that took most time, like drafting them at least, and the lawyers kind of go over them, make sure that they're, written, appropriately before sending them to the experts, and that could endorse your application, right? So I think in my case, that process took about 2 to 3 months. I don't remember exactly, preparing the paperwork. I also discussed, so the company hired the lawyers and we dealt with the lawyers directly. My hiring manager did not know about, how to proceed, what visa type to do, none of that. So I did everything with the attorneys, and after gathering all the paperwork, I actually had to travel outside the US, so they recommended that I travel first, and when I get back, they could file. So when I got back to the US after after my trip, they prepared to file. They used the premium processing, which is, I think it was an extra $2,000 or something like that, that the company paid for. And I think it was crazy because it was 2 or 3 weeks after that it was approved, which kind of surprises me, because I was still working at the lab at Zuckerman, kind of preparing my sign out and everything. And I received a notice like your O1A status is approved. So that kind of triggered like an alarm. It's like I'm no longer allowed to work for MSK, I think. So at that moment, it kind of transitioned out, but it was already in the works way before that. My PI, my boss at MSK, knew about it. He was actually very helpful in helping me get the letters of endorsement. So if there's a recommendation here for anyone in the audience, it's like you probably have to discuss the transition with your boss and supervisor at MSK, because they could really provide a lot of help, through their network and connections to help you with the procedure. So that was my case. I would say, like, in terms of like credentials and all of that. So it was I had like a like a good number of first author papers and citations and and all of that to accompany the application. So that did help, I guess. You know, and yeah, I mean, that's kind of my summary of my experience.
Thank you, Sammy, so much. And yeah, so Brenton, the premium processing, is it really only 2 or 3 weeks now from when the company submits?
Yeah, premium processing moves relatively quickly. It's also getting more expensive. You know, for an example, it's also available for national interest waivers now. Immigration indicates that they can take up to 45 days on a premium processing for a national interest waiver, but generally speaking, you see it on the low end of that. So I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the next. I don't think we have, this is options. I don't think I have any of my colleagues utilized any of these options, but if you're making that transition from academia to industry, here's some things to think about. Well, what about an L1? And I think now that science and research is, you know, there are more multinational companies involved. If you don't make the H1B, maybe you don't qualify for an O1. What about working for a multinational company? An L1 could work if you actually left the United States and worked abroad for one of their either, you know, sister companies, affiliates, whatever. So you can work for at least 1 year, and then you could come back on either an L1A, manager, executive, or L1B, specialized knowledge. E2, so what's all that about? Well, what about if you found a company or organization that is at least 50% owned by nationals of your home country, and your country qualified as an E2 treaty country? Then potentially that would be an option. And then we have some other country-specific possibilities. The TN, that's for certain professional positions for Canadian and Mexican nationals. Australia, you've got the E3, and Chile and Singapore have the H1B1. Similar to the H1B. No, there is a cap on it, but I don't think it's ever been reached. And I think someone mentioned earlier, don't forget about the lottery, the green card lottery. If you're from a country that is eligible for that, you know, put your name in. One thing I would just say quickly about the lottery, there are a lot of organizations and companies that say that they will charge you money to make your application and to enter your application. No, it's a free application and it's pretty easy to do. You don't need to hire a lawyer or anybody like that to enter the green card lottery. Very easy to do and something you can do yourself. And quite frankly, hiring someone is not going to increase your chances. Now, with that being said, we've heard a lot about the temporary visas, and I touched on earlier. So how do you potentially make the transition to permanent status? And it's interesting, I think, this slide, and you know, full sort of disclosure here for the audience, my colleagues and I, my panelists, we didn't really talk about these slides, you know, before I started today, and yet they've touched on some of the things that I am talking about here. You know, someone spoke earlier about employer policies over sponsorship, you know, when to have those conversations. You know, you might not want to have it on day one. You might not want to be sort of knocking on doors on day one, but just the same as that, you don't want to leave it too late. So I think judging that, you know, that relationship in your employer-employee sense. I do want to say one thing is that even though these avenues, they can feel sort of restrictive and difficult to navigate, as highly qualified individuals, you have options that many other highly qualified professionals in the United States do not. The national interest waiver that Daria mentioned earlier, and other, you know, options are not necessarily available for people in other industries. I mean, they are, but they're a little more difficult to navigate. However, and it was mentioned again earlier, filing concurrently with a national interest waiver and an adjustment of status, that ship has sailed. We're now looking at visa retrogression. So I think now the idea of sort of strategizing and thinking multiple steps ahead becomes important. So, you know, you may not want to hear this, but be ready to play the long game. Employer-sponsored versus self-sponsored. This is just fairly informational as we sort of continue to move forward through the information here today. Employer, that's the traditional method. You have an employer sponsoring you for a green card. A self-petitioned application is where you as the individual are driving the process. And so it can give you additional options and it can open additional doors for you from a career standpoint. But be prepared because it is a restrictive standard. I think at the end of the day, if you're in a position professionally, personally and professionally, to be able to process a self-petitioned application, you're going to open more doors and have more options regarding ongoing employment. If you're being sponsored for a green card, there's the three methods. In an industry setting, you're talking about perm. That's the traditional method, getting sponsored. You advertise the position. University setting, we're looking at perm special handling, and then outstanding professor or researcher can be done in industry, more commonly utilized in an academic setting. But for many people, you're going to have to potentially do this on your own. So what about self-sponsored green cards? So is this something that you can consider? What is it? Well, it's a self-sponsored application. So what are you asking? What I like to say is it's a very fancy way of asking a very simple question. Do I qualify for a green card? Do I qualify for a green card as an alien of extraordinary ability? Do I qualify for a green card as an advanced degree alien performing work in the US national interest? Well, logically speaking, the next step to take or the next question to ask is, well, am I qualified? Regardless of which process you are going to engage with or pursue, you're going to need strong professional credentials. What I like to tell people is all of the research is important. Not all of the research is significant. Someone just, I can't remember who it was, forgive me, but mentioned, doing Euro 1, you had a lot of first author papers, the citation numbers. These are the things that you're going to have to bring to the table. But I do think it is important to prepare yourself and be ready for this. Again, things are changing in terms of visa retrogression, visa numbers. So start thinking 2 to 3 steps ahead of where you are. And I do also think it's important to get a full and frank evaluation of your credentials, whether that is in a company/industry setting, looking at your background and credentials, whether you may be a good candidate for an O1, whether they want to sponsor you, or even if you're going to self-petition and go and talk to a lawyer or whomever, make sure that you're getting the correct information. I look at CVs a lot. I'm not afraid to tell someone if I think something may be premature. So get that evaluation of your credentials so you can make informed decisions. Self-petitioning, you have the intent to continue working in your field in the United States. You're not tied to a specific employer. So therefore, you do have these other doors open, other options available to you. And if you have to leave, you can still self-petition and come back. Because at the end of the day, scientific research is recognized for its importance regardless of where you are doing it geographically. So what you can bring to the table from a accomplishment contribution standpoint, you can still file this case if you have to leave or even if you choose to leave. So these are all positive options for you moving forward. A couple of people have touched on this earlier, and I think it's really important that talking about mentors and networking, because going and getting those letters of recommendation, going and getting those expert opinion letters, talking to a lab chief, a PI, who may actually help you get an independent letter from one of their colleagues. So, generating visibility, mentors, networking, these are all aspects of your career development that can now suddenly become important when you take that step in an immigration and visa standpoint. So now we're going to move in quickly into the 2 main self-sponsored, and I'll talk about these very quickly and then I'll turn it over to get some feedback. EB1A, extraordinary ability. Yes, if you have that Nobel Prize, you'll get one. But no, you don't need the Nobel Prize, just as it was alluded to earlier. You do, however, need to meet 3 categories out of 10. Certain categories are judged fairly objectively. So, for example, if you have peer reviewed for journals, you will generally be given judge of the work of others. If you have published in scientific journals, you will generally be given publications. Certain other categories are much more subjective. So, for example, can you show that you have made original scientific contributions of major significance? Well, yes, the contribution will inherently be original. The manner and extent of the contribution can very well be seen to be significant. Can it be seen to be of major significance? And so that gives an immigration officer a little bit of more subjective and discretionary ability in adjudicating a case. Can you show that you played a leading or critical role in an organization of distinguished reputation? Yes, leading will generally be organizational hierarchy, critical, a little bit more subjective or discretionary. Ultimately, you got to show that you're one of the few at the top of your field. Alternatively, you can look at the national interest waiver. Generally speaking, almost certainly a better alternative for early and mid-career researchers, looking at a cumulative and broad analysis of your overall body of work. However, the mere act of publication, presentation, and dissemination in and of itself is not enough. You, however, are driving the process. So you're not tied to any specific employer. there's the test. Substantial merit, national importance. Are you well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor? And ultimately, would it be beneficial to the United States for you to be here? And we would hope that the answer to all those questions would be yes. This is where I'm going to sort of turn it over a little bit to sort of get some input from some of my colleagues, I suppose. Let me just make sure. Well, actually, I'll leave it till the next slide. So here's some of the things. I think it's important how to frame your application, especially if you're an industry-based applicant. So, you know, yes, the work continues to be important, but how do you frame it? Because industry research at times can be a little bit different. So important to frame it that it meets the test of either the EB1A and or the EB2 NIW rather. Here are some of the aspects, regardless of whether you're filing for academia or industry. If you are filing as a researcher, citation, a lot of immigration officers would like to see those citation numbers. But we also have to keep in mind that different disciplines are different. So different disciplines can lend themselves a little differently to citations or lack thereof. So think about the other aspects of your career that can be a strength to you. Could be cover articles, editorial highlights, potential grants and funding. Maybe you have patents. So it's your case, okay? This is not a one size fits all. Get the evaluation about your own credentials. Ultimately, it's one of the few at the top of your field, EB1A. How well positioned are you to advance the endeavor is EB2. So what about the different opportunities and options? At the end of the day, in pursuing a self-petitioned application, you're required to continue in the same or allied field of endeavor. So it's about the application of your scientific knowledge in different avenues, in different ways. You're not tied to one position, and therefore you do have other opportunities and options. So at this point, I'm going to pause again. I've given you the information, and I'll throw it out there to see if we can get some quick feedback in terms of real world stories.
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, this was super useful to hear. Jean, if you don't mind being the next panelist to contribute. So I know your story that you had applied for a green card before you were then interviewing and landed your job at Regeneron. Could you tell us more about why you felt like that was the best option for you to pursue before interviewing within industry?
I think I will share briefly on my story. I think for postdocs, we don't have OPT, that we don't have the visa option that immediately that we can work the next day when we get an offer. I think that's very important for some of startup companies. When I have some conversations with them, I think even one of the company, they gave an offer that asks you to go to start working the next Monday. So I think in that scenario that the green card is very important. And another aspect, I think another important thing is that, especially for the people coming from China or India, we have extended a long time of the waiting period for the green card. I think it's very important to apply the NIW to lock in the what's that called? The priority date, and then we after we accumulate more citations and achieve more success in academically, and we can then use that priority date to apply for EB1A or EB1B. Then we can quickly get the green card. I think that is my story. I think I applied for NIW back in the 2020, and then later I found there's an opportunity for MSK sponsored EB1B for me to apply for the green card that with like shorter with my priority date that's current. Then that is how I get the green card eventually. And I think that helped me a lot during my job application. Actually, I even started before the job application when I actually get the green card approved. I think I get much, from my experience, I have to say, and during the very competitive like job market last year, I definitely get much more job interviews from smaller or startup company after I secure the green card. Yeah, that's what I've been learned during my job search. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean. And do you mind if I ask that? So in the end, your green card was sponsored by MSK, by your academic institution, and how much longer did you stay at MSK before moving on to industry?
I stayed like 6 months. Yeah. I think that's required, right? That's required to stay more than 6 months before you left the like institution support your the EB1B green card.
Great, yeah. You're not the only person I've heard who was in that situation, so I just know that colloquially, but maybe we'll ask Brendan to also comment on that as well. Like if you're sponsored by your university and then you leave the university, how long you should stay, or it's expected that you stay. Yeah, maybe Brendan, would you mind commenting?
Okay, so first of all, a lot of what you said there is I totally agree with, and it'll be in a subsequent slide, establishing a priority date versus visa retrogression, allowing you to continue to enhance your credentials. Let me, I'll answer quite carefully in terms of an employer-sponsored application that it is supposed to be a bona fide offer of permanent employment. And then so I generally feel that I think if you were in a position for less than 6 months after receipt of a green card, it potentially could be viewed as a little problematic by USCIS in the future. If, for example, you were going for citizenship or something like that. So, for example, was your intent to take this position permanently? And generally speaking, 6 months is probably not a bad rule of thumb.
Great, and I think so you had also mentioned the locking in the priority date. Do you have a slide on that as well? Because when John was mentioning that, I thought maybe we should talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, and I know just in the interest of everyone's time, and I know to get to our breakout rooms, I can probably just finish the last couple of slides here to finish my portion of it. Right here, it's backlogs, right? And it's now affecting everyone. So basically, as it says right there, backlogs are hitting hard, and for some more than others. I don't have to tell anyone from India and China how backlogs have impacted them over the past number of years. But now everyone is being impacted. And so I think it was Daria had mentioned earlier that about filing a concurrent I-140 national interest waiver and adjustment. And that was a great strategy to take. I'd love it if we could still take that strategy, actually, but we cannot. So right there, you got to now strategize. So for everybody, you got to keep your eye on the numbers as you continue to move forward. But just as was said a moment ago, for China and India, you can hold your place in line. So you can establish a priority date by filing an EB2. What that means is, let's say you think you can qualify for an EB2, but you're just not ready for the EB1 yet. You file your national interest waiver, you get that approved. That then establishes that date for all subsequent EB employment-based applications. So you're basically holding your place in line. It's important to remember that an approved EB2 can allow you to extend your H1B beyond the 6-year limit. And it can also, if you have a H4 spouse, it can allow your H4 spouse to obtain work authorization. So I know sometimes people, especially from China and India, are like, well, what's the point? You know, with my EB2, it's not getting me anywhere. It's still an important facet of getting to where you need to be. And I think the example that was just given by my colleague a moment ago is a good example of that and how to navigate it. So that's retrogression. There's only a finite number of green cards given out every year. So let's look at it pragmatically, right? I mean, these are difficult issues. I genuinely believe that while it says right there, the extensive visa usage is changing the dynamic for everyone. If you prepare yourself and learn what is in front of you, the avenues are there, just as has been conveyed to the audience today by my fellow panelists in terms of their actual personal and professional situations and examples. The avenues are there to be able to positively navigate this, because, you know, it doesn't feel like this sometimes, but, you know, the United States recognizes the importance of science. I think the NIH budget just came out recently again, and it's, you know, maybe has plateaued a little bit. You know, there's a finite pool of money, but science is important in this country. International researchers are important to the science in this country. And at the end of the day, with the proper guidance and preparation, you can get to where you want and need to be. And there is not, as I said earlier, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to this. I sort of liken it to a river. There's like a lot of little different tributaries that flow down to the sea, but you can get there. And not everybody's going to take the same pathway, but the pathways are there, the avenues are open. And just as you've heard from everybody today, you know, there are successful pathways to do this. So finally, yes, it is an election year. Whoops, it is an election year. So I will say this, I do live in DC, but nothing goes on here anyway. So I like to say, I do like the movie. I think it's Encanto. We don't talk about Bruno, so I'm not gonna talk about that today. We're gonna see a lot of rumor. There's gonna be a lot of conjecture over the coming months. You're gonna read a lot of stuff. So stay informed, yes, but also stay grounded. Okay, let's hope the sky isn't falling in. And I do want to always end these on the positive, that over the last sort of little over 24 months, STEM is now in play. It's been talked about a lot for a number of years about how STEM should be, you know, more warranted. It's now in play via executive order. And so these are positive steps forward. And so the guidance is helping. The guidance is helping these pathways for you guys to open up. And I think if you explore the pathways that my colleagues have talked about today, you know, you can, again, get to where you want and need to be. So with that, I think we did pretty well. We only ran over a few minutes. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and then you guys can sort of navigate the breakout rooms. Thank
you, Brendan. Yeah, thank you to all the panelists for sharing. I just wanted to make sure, because I know there were two other panelists, Linda and Daria. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but did both of you, you had the NIW or the National Interest Waiver at some point in your job search process? Perhaps Linda, if you could just comment a little bit about your experience, and then Daria.
For me, right. So I was married. I am married. So at the time we had to strategize sort of next steps and what to do. I was a student graduating with my PhD, and I was sure that I didn't want to be in academia or do a postdoc. So my option was OPT, and then from that an H-1B or something else. My husband, he was a postdoc. He had much better publication records. So we decided for him to apply for the NIW. So he went through all the process, doing all the letters and, you know, reviewing all that information. I had a lot of knowledge, so I helped with all of the lawyer conversations. So in the breakout room, I'm happy to expand more on this, but it was a great path for us because it gave us the freedom to not be dependent on employers on any sort of career move that we wanted to make.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so if someone's in a similar situation with a spouse, maybe that you can give them some advice there as well. And Daria, anything to add about your experience?
Yeah, so I had national interest waiver, and I initiated the process myself while being a postdoc at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I found my own lawyers. I just asked friends around, and I also got help from other friends who already went through that process. What else could I? Yeah, at that time it was slightly easier, but unfortunately for me, again, everything took forever, and I got my work authorization 2 months before I got my green card, which is kind of useless. But overall, yes, it's huge relief when you get green card. Essentially, you can be unemployed and still stay in the country. You can travel, you can find a job, there are no restrictions. So if you have any doubts, like if it's too expensive and so on, just like don't think about it. It's really going to pay back.
Great, thank you. And actually, if it's okay, I'll just ask one more question. We'll open the breakout rooms after. But Wanjun from Amgen, you had mentioned earlier to have these conversations about your company sponsoring you for a green card. So what kind of things are they looking at? Because we talked about, you know, like the CV, publications, grants. Like what would Amgen be looking at to assess if they would consider sponsoring you for a green card?
So they first sent out a questionnaire, and I Googled it. So I think they basically follow the the EB1B, like EB1OR category. So if you're interested in, you can search online. So they ask a lot of questions like what publication you have, how many ordinary research contribution you have, and then briefly talk about that. And then how many citations, non-self citations, if you have any award, like the more significant ones, not like a travel award, but the like national wise or international wise award. And then if your research have been on a news or public news, something like that. And there are a lot of categories. I can only think about these now, but I'm sure there are more. So they will evaluate based on each person's case. And then, so from my experience and what I know is that some of my colleagues, after the evaluation, so the attorney suggests them to go through EB2 perm. And so some of the cases, the lawyer will suggest them to go through EB1OR. So after that, you'll initiate it and then start to collaborating with your lawyer. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so the evaluation of your CV continues to be an important process for you to be proactive about and
Yes.
engage
Yes.
with a lawyer about. Great. Any final comments from any of the other panelists before we open the breakout rooms? And I hope it's okay that if the panelists are okay with, we'll keep them open maybe an extra 5 minutes. We had said we would end at 5:30 or, you know, Eastern Standard Time, but if I keep it open for an extra 5 minutes beyond then, if everyone be okay with that?
It's okay.
Okay, great. Any other final comments from the other panelists before we open the breakout rooms? Okay, great. So now we're hoping that all of you who are with us here, you'll get to ask each of the panelists some more specific questions about the company, where they work, how they've enjoyed working there, and any other specific things about their job, you know, because we didn't talk about that as much in the first half. It was more about their immigration status. But now if you have more specific questions about their company, and then also we will have Brendan Delaney in one of the rooms as well. So again, we have Sami Belhaj at Ambry Genetics, Brendan Delaney at Frank and Delaney Immigration Law, Linda Mola at Regeneron, Daria Shlueva at Clade Therapeutics and Generation Bio previously, Zhongming Wang at Genentech, Wanjing Wu at Amgen, and last but not least, John Zhang at Regeneron. So there's 7 rooms. They're now open. Please join, you know, whoever you want to speak with, join that room. Like I said, I'll keep it open a little bit longer since we're starting late. And then I'll close the rooms and we'll just come back to say goodbye at that point. So we hope you'll have some fruitful conversations. The panelists can join their room and I'll stay here if there's any technical difficulties people experience. And we'll keep them open so you can have all those exciting conversations.